The first snow of December did not fall so much as it descended slow, indifferent, and unbroken over the forgotten valley that held Camp 11. Men said the wind here could cut through wool, leather, and bone in equal measure. If that was true, then the cold inside the prisoner barracks was a blade with no handle slicing anyone unlucky enough to breathe. Inside barracks, see, the stove had died long before sunrise. Frost spread across the wooden planks like pale veins, a map of winter claiming the structure inch by inch. The prisoners, still alive, huddled in wool blankets worn so thin that light could pass through them. The air smelled of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of old despair. At the end of the room, Lieutenant James Carter sat on the lower bunk he had kept since his arrival 3 months earlier. He wasn't a large man, never had been, but now he seemed carved down to his bones. His uniform hung off him like wet laundry. His cheeks were hollow, his lips cracked in thin lines, and his eyes, once sharp and alert, glimmered with a dull, persistent fatigue. In front of him sat a tin bowl of stew, if one could call it that. It was mostly cloudy water, with thin slivers of vegetables, and maybe on lucky days, a finger-sized strip of meat. Steam curled up from it in lazy waves, disappearing before reaching his face. Around him, the other prisoners devoured their rations with the single-minded desperation of men who knew the next meal would be no better and might not come at all. But Carter did not eat, not immediately, not anymore. He waited until the others were occupied, until spoons clattered, slurping masked sound, and guards were not looking through the frost-smeared windows. Then, with a familiar, almost ritualistic motion, he lifted the bowl, leaned slightly forward, and poured half of it into a folded cloth hidden beneath the bunk slats. He tied the cloth quickly, making sure the knot was tight and the parcel secure. Only then did he lift the remaining stew to his mouth and drink. His hands shook, his throat struggled, his stomach cramped with painful hunger, a twisting ache that had become as constant as his heartbeat. From the bunk across the aisle, Private Samuel Harris watched him. Harris was younger than Carter by 6 or 7 years, but looked older now. Too many nights of cold, too many hours of forced labor, too little food. His eyes were sunken but sharp with concern. Jimmy Harris whispered when the guards moved farther down the row, "You're gonna disappear one of these days. You can't keep doing that." "I'm fine," Carter said, though his voice was brittle. "No, you're not. You're barely holding on as it is." Carter didn't reply. He never did. Across the room, another prisoner murmured, "Man refuses to eat half his ration. He's either insane or noble." Someone else added, "Or hiding it for someone." But nobody's seen him give it away. They were right. No one had seen him. No one understood. And Carter preferred it that way. He didn't want explanations. He didn't want questions. He didn't want anyone interfering, because the truth would make no sense to them, because the truth was dangerous. Boot steps crunched outside the door, sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable. The barracks fell quiet. The spoon clatter died. The prisoners straightened instinctively like beaten dogs anticipating a kick. The door jerked open. A wind like shattered glass blew in before the guards did. 2 of them entered Sergeant Mertz, whose face always seemed on the edge of a snarl, and Corporal Lucas Reinhardt, younger, quieter, and far less cruel than the others. Mertz's voice was harsh. "Inspection. Line up." Carter and the others obeyed, forming a crooked line between the bunks. Mertz paced with his usual brutality, kicking aside anything on the floor and shoving prisoners who didn't move fast enough. Reinhardt followed behind him, lantern in hand, his eyes scanning without the same anger, though no one could tell what he was thinking. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on Carter. Just a second. Barely long enough to notice. But Carter noticed. He always did. Reinhardt continued walking, but there was something different in the way he looked around the barracks tonight, something more alert, more focused, more curious. And Carter felt a knot form in his stomach, not hunger but worry. The hidden ration under his bunk felt suddenly heavier, as though it had turned into a lead weight. He had been careful for 21 days, careful enough to avoid suspicion, careful enough that his secret had stayed buried. But secrets in a prison camp were like smoke, they eventually seeped through the cracks. When the inspection ended, the guards left. The door slammed shut. The prisoners relaxed by inches, but Carter didn't. He sat back down on his bunk and stared at the plank of wood concealing the cloth bundle. What he was doing was reckless, maybe even suicidal. No prisoner in his right mind gave up food willingly. It wasn't just foolish, it was suspicious. And if the guards found out why he was saving it— No, Carter told himself. He won't find out. No one will. He leaned back against the icy wall, letting his eyes close. But behind his eyelids he saw the moment he'd been replaying for 16 days, the moment Reinhardt had stepped between him and Weber in the yard, sparing Carter from what could have been a broken jaw or cracked ribs. A moment Reinhardt had probably forgotten already. But Carter hadn't. It had been the first spark of humanity he'd seen from a guard in 3 months, and maybe the last one he would ever see. He owed the man something more than gratitude, something real. Something that proved not all debts were paid in violence. But gratitude in a prison camp was a dangerous currency. 1 ration could mean survival, half a ration could mean death. And yet, Carter opened his eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "It's worth it." He didn't hear the quiet crunch of snow outside. He didn't see the faint shadow pause at the frosted window. He didn't know that Corporal Reinhardt had stopped again to look at him. He didn't know that Reinhardt had already begun wondering, why does that prisoner keep starving himself? The question would not leave the young guard alone, and soon it would change both of their lives. Corporal Lucas Reinhardt had grown used to sleepless nights, but lately the hours after midnight had begun to stretch in strange, suffocating ways. He found himself hearing things he never noticed before. Distant groans from the hospital hut, the wind scraping loose shingles, the creaking of the outer fence as the cold tightened its grip on the wood. But the sound that haunted him most wasn't a noise from the camp. It was silence. The silence that followed him everywhere, like an invisible weight hanging on his shoulders. At 24, Reinhardt should have been at home in Stuttgart fixing clocks with his father. He should have been walking along the river with Elise, the girl who used to write him long letters about ordinary things: her neighbor's dog, the smell of bread from the bakery, the way the sun hit the church roof at sunset. Letters full of life, of warmth. But life had pulled him here instead, to Camp 11, a place that felt as far from warmth as the moon. The barracks, the guard towers, the frost-bitten fences, everything in the camp looked like it had been built by someone who believed comfort made men weak. Wood splintered like old bones, metal froze to the touch, and the sky was always the color of dirty wool. Reinhardt walked these frozen paths every night during rounds, lantern in hand, rifle over his shoulder, trying not to think too deeply about how easily a man could disappear here. He didn't expect to feel anything about the prisoners, not sympathy, not curiosity. He had learned early that emotional distance was a survival skill. If you didn't feel, you didn't break. But one prisoner, one quiet, starving man, had broken that rule without trying. Lieutenant James Carter. Reinhardt didn't know why this prisoner of all the others stayed lodged in his mind. Maybe it was the way Carter carried himself, a kind of disciplined dignity that didn't belong in a place like this. Maybe it was the way the man never complained, never begged, never fought back. Or maybe it was because Carter had a look Reinhardt recognized too well, the look of someone who had lost nearly everything, but refused to surrender the peace that mattered most. The peace that said, "I am still human." That unspoken recognition unsettled Reinhardt in ways he didn't want to admit. But what unsettled him more was the lieutenant's slow decline. For 3 weeks he had watched Carter shrink, watched the man's cheeks hollow, watched his hands tremble when he walked, watched him move as though each breath cost him something. The camp starved all its prisoners slowly, but Carter was disappearing faster than the rest, and last night Reinhardt could swear it. Carter had been careful, too careful. When he believed no one was watching, the lieutenant had hunched over like someone protecting a secret. Reinhardt hadn't been able to shake the image. Tonight snow fell again, thicker, heavier. The lantern's flame trembled in the wind as Reinhardt walked toward Barracks C. He tried to tell himself he was only following orders, doing his job, nothing more. But his steps slowed when he reached the door. He lifted the latch quietly. Inside, men were already lying down, bundled beneath thin blankets. Shadows stretched across their faces, turning exhaustion into something sharper, something desperate. But they didn't stir as Reinhardt stepped in. They were used to his gentle approach. Unlike Sergeant Mertz, Reinhardt didn't shout or shove. He walked down the aisle lantern, casting a warm circle across the freezing floor. Then he saw Carter, sitting on his bunk, bowl in his hands. and doing exactly what Reinhardt feared, tipping half of it into a cloth bundle beneath the wooden slats. Reinhardt froze. It was subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but he saw it. Half the ration, hidden away, again. Carter paused, suddenly sensing movement. His eyes flicked upward, meeting Reinhardt's. For a breath, neither man moved. Reinhardt forced himself to continue walking as though he hadn't seen anything. He passed the bunk, heart pounding, and completed the inspection with an expression he hoped revealed nothing. But inside, his thoughts spun like a machine with gears grinding out of place. Why would a hungry man, one clearly on the edge of collapse, hide food? He stepped back into the cold and shut the door behind him. Snow landed softly on his cap, his coat, his boots, but Reinhardt barely felt it, because the questions kept coming. Was Carter giving the food to another prisoner? No, Reinhardt would have noticed movement, exchanges, whispers. Carter barely spoke to anyone. Was he saving it for himself? Perhaps for later. That made no sense. Food spoiled quickly in this cold, and hunger didn't wait for tomorrow. Was he pretending to be weaker than he was? Again, impossible. Carter was already too thin, too frail. The only answer that made even a sliver of sense was the most absurd one. He's saving it for someone else. But who? A prisoner who never approached him. Or, Reinhardt's breath caught, or a guard gnome. Absolutely not. Insanity. Prisoners didn't starve themselves for their captors. It went against every instinct of survival. And yet, something in Carter's expression when their eyes met something steady, unflinching, almost peaceful, gnawed at Reinhardt's certainty. He had seen that expression once before. 16 days ago in the yard, when Corporal Weber had been seconds away from beating Carter bloody. Weber had snapped barking insults, fists raised, boots ready to strike, and Carter, exhausted, bruised, starving, had simply stood there, jaw set, eyes unwavering. No fear, just a strange, calm acceptance. Reinhardt had stepped between them without thinking. Instinct, reflex, a small piece of himself acting before the uniform could stop him. He'd told Weber to walk away. He barely remembered the words now, but Carter must have remembered, because the man looked at him that day with the same expression Reinhardt had seen tonight, the expression of someone who owed a debt he intended to repay. Reinhardt leaned against the barracks wall, lantern trembling faintly in his grip. Is that it? Is he saving the food for me? The idea was ridiculous, impossible, unthinkable, but the longer Reinhardt stood in the falling snow, the harder it became to dismiss the thought. Carter had no family here, no friends, no allies, no one to protect, no one to care for. Every day was a struggle to survive. Every calorie mattered, yet the lieutenant was giving half his sustenance to someone he clearly valued more than himself. A gust of wind cut across the yard, snapping Reinhardt back to reality. He returned to the guard cabin, but his mind remained tangled the entire night. He lay awake on the hard cot, staring at the rafters, listening to Mert snoring on the bunk above. The lantern flickered out, plunging the room into blackness. Still, Reinhardt didn't close his eyes. He couldn't, because whenever he tried, he saw Carter sitting on the bunk, pouring away half his life into a cloth bundle. For a guard. For him. The thought struck him somewhere deep, somewhere he thought the war had already hollowed out. By the time dawn bled across the sky in dull streaks of gray, Reinhardt had made a decision. One he wasn't sure was wise, one he wasn't sure was safe, but one he couldn't stop himself from making. Tonight he would confront Carter, and he would find out the truth. Snow fell again the next morning, relentless and heavy, muffling the world beneath a thick white silence. The storm had swallowed the horizon, turning the camp into a dim, colorless blur of wood and wire. Everything was still except for the steady beat of tension that had begun to pulse beneath the routines of Camp 11. Inside barracks. Lieutenant Carter sat on his bunk, his breaths shallow and controlled as he lifted his morning ration to his mouth. As always, he took only a sip before glancing toward the door. No guards inside yet. No one watching. He bent down, hands trembling, and quietly tipped half the watery stew into the cloth bundle beneath the bunk. He didn't even have to look anymore. His hands knew the movement, the way a violinist knows the strings by memory or a priest knows each motion of a prayer. It had become a ritual not of survival but of intention. And every ritual had a breaking point. Today was that point. Before Carter could finish concealing, the bundle boots crunched outside the door. Snow scraped beneath soles. The knob rattled. Carter's heart jumped. The door swung open. Corporal Lucas Reinhardt stepped inside, lantern in hand, his expression unreadable but sharper than Carter had ever seen. His breath frosted in front of him as he scanned the room. He ignored the other prisoners, who straightened instinctively. His focus was fixed on one man, Lieutenant Carter. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the barracks like an axe. Carter froze. Slowly he lifted his eyes. "Corporal," Reinhardt gestured with his chin. "Stand." Carter obeyed, rising slowly, fighting back a wave of dizziness. Hunger clawed at him with familiar persistence, but adrenaline sharpened his senses. The other prisoners watched from their bunks in dead silence. Reinhardt nodded toward the bed. "Step aside." Carter's pulse hammered. "There's nothing," I said. "Step aside." Reluctantly, Carter moved. Reinhardt crouched and reached beneath the bunk. Time slowed. Carter felt every heartbeat, every breath, every crackle of fire from the lantern. And then Reinhardt's hand brushed the cloth package. The corporal pulled it out. Snow drifted gently through the cracked window as he stood holding the soaked bundle between his gloved fingers. The cloth was warm. The stew inside had softened the threads. The smell of broth, faint but unmistakable, drifted upward. The barracks exhaled in unison. Reinhardt stared at the bundle, then at Carter, then back at the bundle. It wasn't anger on his face, it was something worse, confusion, and a hurt Carter hadn't expected. Reinhardt untied the cloth and peeled it open. The meager half-portion of stew glistened in the cold air. The sight of it made Carter's stomach twist violently with hunger, but his gaze stayed on Reinhardt. The corporal's voice was tight, controlled. "You've been hiding this, every day." Carter didn't answer. Reinhardt's nostrils flared. "Are you trading, hoarding, feeding someone else?" "No." Reinhardt stepped closer. "Then who is this for silence?" The corporal's voice lowered to a near whisper. "Lieutenant, tell me." Snow pressed against the windows, blanketing the camp in white. A distant whistle sounded, guard shift changing outside. But inside Barracks C, the world had narrowed to two men and one impossible truth. Carter swallowed hard. "It's for you." Reinhardt flinched as though struck. The prisoners gasped. Even Harris, who had suspected something strange for days, stared in disbelief. "For me," Reinhardt repeated slowly. "Yes." The corporal shook his head. No, that makes no sense. Prisoners don't starve themselves for guards." Carter's voice was quiet but unwavering. "Not usually." Then why Carter drew a shaky breath. His ribs ached with the motion. 16 days ago, he said softly in the yard, Corporal Weber was about to break my jaw. Or worse. He was angry, furious, and willing to take it out on anyone smaller than him. I'd seen him do it before. Reinhardt stiffened. He remembered the moment vaguely, like a half-forgotten dream. A shove, raised voices, cold wind biting at his neck as he stepped in front of Weber. Carter continued. "You stopped him. You stood between us. You told him I wasn't worth the trouble." Reinhardt winced. Hearing his own words reflected back sounded harsher, colder than he remembered. "You protected me," Carter said. "You didn't have to. You gained nothing. You risked punishment. And no one even thanked you." Silence fell like a new layer of snow. Carter looked directly into Reinhardt's eyes. "I wanted to repay that." The corporal's disbelief cracked into something rawer, frustration, confusion, a painful echo of guilt. "You repay that by starving yourself," he demanded. "I repay that," Carter said calmly, "by giving the only thing I have." Reinhardt's throat tightened. Carter wasn't lying. The truth was in his posture, his eyes, the tremor of his hands. This wasn't manipulation. There was no hidden agenda. Carter had simply chosen to sacrifice something vital in exchange for a kindness Reinhardt barely remembered offering. No one had done anything like that for Reinhardt in years, not since his mother, not since Elise, not since the war had turned his life into a uniform, a name on a roster, a cog in a machine that didn't care if he ate, slept, or broke apart. And now a prisoner, a starving, freezing, dying prisoner, was saying, "I see you." Reinhardt closed the cloth with shaking fingers. "You shouldn't have done this," he whispered. "I know." Carter said. "But I did." "You think I'll take this from you?" "No." Carter managed a thin smile. "I think you needed to know it existed." Reinhardt looked down at the bundle again. The food inside was pitiful, barely enough to sustain a man. Yet somehow in this moment it weighed more in meaning than any banquet he'd eaten before the war. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the barracks door. The lantern flickered. Reinhardt exhaled slowly. "If Sergeant Mertz found this—" "He didn't," Carter said quietly. "But he could have. And you could have let Weber hit me." Reinhardt opened his mouth, closed it, and shook his head. "This is madness," he murmured. Carter nodded. "War is madness. This is something else." Reinhardt stared at him for a long moment. Then, surprising even himself, he wrapped the cloth and placed it back in Carter's hands. The prisoners murmured, shocked. Carter blinked. "Corporal, keep it hidden," Reinhardt said softly, "and don't let anyone else see it." Carter swallowed hard. But Reinhardt's voice was firm. "That is an order, not the kind that came from cruelty, the kind that came from protection, a kind Reinhardt hadn't given in a very long time." He turned toward the door but paused before opening it. Without looking back, he said, "What you saved, I understand now." Carter's breath caught. "Do you?" Reinhardt nodded once. And for the first time since arriving at Camp 11, Corporal Lucas Reinhardt felt something shift inside him, quiet but profound. A reminder, a spark, proof he hadn't completely turned into the uniform he wore. He stepped out into the raging snow, closing the door quietly behind him. Inside, Carter sat down slowly onto his bunk, the cloth ration shaking faintly in his hands, not from cold, but from something dangerously close to hope. Night fell differently over Camp 11 after Reinhardt returned the hidden ration to Carter. It seemed quieter somehow, though not in the usual deadened, frozen way. This quiet held something else, something tense, fragile, shifting beneath the surface like a river under ice. Carter felt the change before he understood it. He lay awake on his bunk long after the others had drifted into the shallow, restless sleep of hungry men. The cloth bundle remained hidden beneath his bed, warm from being held earlier. He stared into the darkness, replaying every moment of his confrontation with Corporal Reinhardt. The shock on the guard's face, the confusion, the unsteady breath. The way Reinhardt had said, "That is an order, not harsh, not cruel, protective." Carter had felt something inside him loosen a knot he didn't know he had been carrying. For the first time since he arrived at the camp, he did not feel entirely alone, but that sliver of humanity came with danger woven into it. And danger came sooner than either man expected. Morning brought another pale, bitter sun. Snow had stopped falling, but wind whipped sharp across the yard, carrying flecks of ice like grit. Labor detail was canceled. The storm had buried the work pits too deeply, so guards patrolled the camp instead, stamping their boots to stay warm and snapping at prisoners who moved too slowly. Carter leaned against the barracks wall outside, assigned to shovel snow away from the door with a bent metal pan. His stomach rumbled painfully, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw Reinhardt across the yard speaking to another guard. The younger man's posture was stiff, his voice low, his shoulders tense beneath his winter coat. Carter saw the moment Reinhardt's eyes flicked toward him, an instinctive glance quick but revealing. Carter pretended not to notice. He bent his head, kept his movements slow, deliberate, but he felt it. A silent connection across the frozen yard, a shared understanding neither of them had chosen. Later that afternoon, Carter returned to Barracks C just as the sun dipped behind clouds, turning the world dim and blue. He knelt beside his bunk and slid aside the plank of wood that concealed the cloth bundle. Instead of taking it out, he simply touched it through the wood. Not for himself, but because he knew what it meant now. Not charity, not desperation, not hope, recognition that someone else in this place still had a soul. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the moment shattered when the door slammed open. Sergeant Mertz stormed inside, dragging cold air and suspicion with him. The man's boots struck the floor like hammer blows. His eyes swept over the prisoners with an almost feral sharpness. "Everyone up," he barked. Groans and protests rose until he silenced them with a glare. Carter stood slowly, heart thudding. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Mertz stalked through the room, kicking aside blankets, flipping over tin cups, yanking open footlockers. Searching. For what or for whom Carter felt dread curl through his stomach. Had Mertz seen something, overheard something? Followed Reinhardt last night. Then the sergeant's eyes landed on Carter. "You," he growled, "out of the way." Carter stepped aside, pulse racing. Mertz crouched, reaching beneath the bunk, straight toward the plank, straight toward the hidden ration. Carter felt the world narrow to a single point. Not now, not like this. Before Mertz's fingers touched the cloth, another voice cut through the barracks. "That's enough, Sergeant." The room froze. Corporal Reinhardt stood in the doorway, breath steaming in the icy air, jaw tight. Mertz glared. "This is an inspection." "No," Reinhardt said, stepping inside. "It's harassment." Mertz scoffed. "These dogs are hiding something. I can feel it." Reinhardt stood taller. "There has been no misconduct reported in this barracks. You're acting on paranoia." Mertz rose slowly, stepping to within inches of Reinhardt, their breath mingling in cold puffs. "And who are you?" he snarled, "to tell me how to conduct an inspection?" Reinhardt didn't flinch. "The man who did the inspection last night, thoroughly." Carter's heart hammered. If Reinhardt slipped, if he revealed even unintentionally what he'd learned, the consequences would be catastrophic. Mertz sneered. "You're hiding something." "I'm hiding nothing," Reinhardt said, voice steady. "But you are disturbing the prisoners without cause." The captain would not approve. Mentioning the captain was a risk, a calculated one. It worked. Mertz spat on the floor and shouldered past. "This barracks stinks of secrets," he muttered. "One way or another, I'll find them." The door slammed behind him. A long silence followed. Reinhardt's eyes scanned the room once more before settling briefly subtly on Carter. Not a look of warning or fear. A question. "Are you all right?" Carter gave the smallest nod. Reinhardt turned away and left without another word. That night the frost thickened on the window glass, turning the barracks into a dim aquarium of shadows. The prisoners slept uneasily. Even the stove seemed wary of breaking the silence. Carter stayed awake, waiting, listening. When the door eased open a crack, he didn't move. Footsteps padded quietly across the floorboards. Reinhardt knelt beside him. In his hand was a battered tin box. "I can't stay long," he murmured. "What happened today?" Carter whispered. "Mertz suspects something," Reinhardt said quietly. Not the truth, but enough to cause trouble. He opened the tin box. Inside was a small heel of burnt bread and a thin slice of potato. More food than any prisoner received in a day. Carter stared. "Why are you risking this?" Reinhardt hesitated, then spoke in a tone Carter had never heard from him before, small, vulnerable, stripped of uniform and rank. "Because today, when Mertz reached under your bunk—" I felt fear. He swallowed. "Not for myself." Carter's chest tightened. Reinhardt continued softly. "Because someone in this place, for reasons I still don't understand, believes I am worth something." The words hung in the air. Carter whispered, "You are." Reinhardt closed his eyes, absorbing the words as though they were more nourishing than the bread he'd brought. "Here," he said at last, pushing the tin toward Carter. "You need this." Carter shook his head. "No." Reinhardt frowned. "Lieutenant." "You take it," Carter said. "I saved the ration for you. That hasn't changed." Reinhardt's breath caught. "You can't be serious." "I am." "No," the corporal whispered. "No. I won't take food from a starving man." Carter looked at him with tired but steady eyes. "You already have." Reinhardt blinked. Carter nodded toward the cloth bundle under the bunk. "You took something that mattered. You understood. You returned it. And you protected me today." His voice softened. "That saved my life more than any ration would." Reinhardt's composure broke just slightly, enough for Carter to see the human being beneath the coat. Carter pushed the tin back to him. "Take it." Reinhardt hesitated. Then slowly he accepted, not because he needed the food, but because he needed the meaning. Far off, a guard blew a whistle. Patrol shift. Reinhardt stood. "I'll come back tomorrow night," he whispered. "You shouldn't," Carter said softly. "It's too dangerous." Reinhardt paused at the door hand on the latch. "For you," he said quietly. "I'll risk it." Then he slipped into the snow. Carter lay back on his bunk, exhaustion pulling at him, hunger gnawing, but something warm, flickering faintly in his chest. A spark, a fragile truth forged between enemies. Tomorrow, the war would still rage. Cold would still bite. Hunger would still haunt every prisoner. Mertz would still prowl. But nothing could erase the simple, impossible fact a starving prisoner had saved half his rations for a guard. And the guard, shocked and shaken, had become the one person willing to save him back. In a world built to destroy humanity, two men had found a way to give it back to each other.